Logan Paul has done it again. He took another one of his hosts to the extreme to end up outside of his podcast. Impaulsive. As usual, this man does his own thing to get attention. We're still wondering how Mike is still with him. But that's for another time. Today, we're going to delve into something very important. Why does George Janko hate Logan Paul? Although the question should be, why shouldn't he hate him? Stick around to find out how it all started, because it is pretty interesting. George Janko's sudden announcement that he was leaving the podcast, and not just any podcast, one of the biggest on the internet, left everyone stunned, especially those who had no idea what was going on. But for those who were more observant, they already knew a little bit of what was going on a few months ago. George's departure was something that had been simmering very slowly. As we know, Logan Paul is a complete jerk. This isn't the first time he's been in controversy, is it? By the way, he wanted to sue CafeZilla for revealing his involvement in a crypto scam, even though he only profited from promoting it instead of taking care of the people affected. And George himself told him so in a podcast. He told him so to his face, of course, with his peaceful tone. We all know that George doesn't have a very strong temper, but he effectively told Logan that he didn't give a damn about the people affected and only cared about himself. And of course, George told Logan not to go ahead with his idea of filing a lawsuit against CafeZilla and to at least listen to the people who are really affected by all of this. Well, he didn't like it at all. In fact, it bothered him quite a bit. This is Logan Paul we're talking about. Yeah, from that point on, you can see the differences between the two of them. But let's stop for a second. Very funny and all, but we need to clarify a few points. He's not the first co-host of Impaulsive. Before him was Mac. Do any of you remember Mac? I imagine some of you do and remember how he got dumped. When you hear Mike make all those hurtful comments about poor Mac, you realize how cruel the environment is. Some people don't live up to the expectations they have, and he didn't deserve that bad treatment. The same burden was placed on George Janko, the third to sit in the chair of the Viper known as Logan Paul. But beyond those comments, George's problem, yes, you can call it a problem, it was that he was too level-headed, a person of logic. And in a show where everything depends on jokes and jokes, there is no time to be sensible. Usually everything is a joke followed by hurtful comments or saying things that are controversial for a few days until the internet forgets about it. Even though George is supposed to be a comedian, he did his best to set the mood. But one day they brought in another comedian to spice things up. You know, the show wasn't at its best, and they needed a super rebellious person. Little did they know that his arrival would be the beginning of the end. Bobby Lee. Yes, Bobby Lee. For those of you who don't know who this guy is, Bobby Lee is like Leslie Chow from What Happened Yesterday. He's a living joke. But unlike him, this one is less cheeky. I can imagine Chow taking his pants off on a podcast, but Bobby Lee never dares to almost throw himself off a building. Anyway, staying on topic, the arrival of this comedian was a big problem, or rather, the trigger for a bigger problem, as this crazy gentleman spent the entire show brushing up against the all-ages content. He literally took his pants off at one point in the episode just to rub it in. And you know who he wanted to rub it in? George, who was the butt of jokes throughout the episode. George Janko's only mistake was thinking it was a good idea to talk about his beliefs in a place where respect doesn't exist. But yes, George opened up about his feelings that were guarded on the edge of trauma. At one point, he was at his worst. He had gained 40 pounds, which was crazy, and in his own words, if he wasn't a Christian, he would probably be suicidal. That's how it was. And it was a time when he wasn't bad financially, he was just empty, and it was because of Christianity that he got through it. And you know how everybody reacted?
I loved what you were saying. It was very long.
That's usually me. That's usually.
But you know, I got what you're saying, and you really inspired me, George. Can I say something?
Comedians suck.
No.
I hate comedians.
No, I want to say something.
Sebastian sucked, left me on red.
Yeah.
You suck. First of all, don't touch me.
Yeah.
Do not touch me.
My bad.
Thank you.
All right. But yeah, we just need writers to edit that down. Like if we had a staff of writers, they'd be like, yeah, we'll cut that. But
I'm sorry.
Essentially, it was a really good monologue.
Usually when I do my comedy, I don't have writers in the room. I actually write my own stuff.
After that, George started to act much more subdued. In fact, a few seconds later, he asks Bobby not to touch him and to take his hand off him. But of course, is it Bobby's fault that Logan and George got into a fight? The answer is no. It's just that, as we said, the two of them had been at each other's throats for a while, which makes us realize that this incident was just a catalyst. And of course, a lot of people went off on George. Even Lee said that his attitude was unprofessional, but
This is that
We need him.
that attitude right there was just unprofessional.
let's be honest, you have to respect people's beliefs and thoughts a little bit, and it's obvious that he was a little upset. But the problem is that the more the podcast went on, the more George got picked on, especially by Paul and Bobby, who bombarded him with comments, until finally, our dear Janko couldn't take it anymore and left the podcast. He left the podcast just like that. This, of course, caused controversy. The most glaring thing about it, aside from the fact that they laughed about it for a while, is that Bobby said his attitude was unprofessional, which, to be honest, is not true if you count the bad treatment he received. And as Mike said, they should suffer the consequences of that chapter. He was the only person with any empathy out of all of them, and from there, it just got worse and worse. It's true that shortly after that, Bobby called, apologized, and made it clear that the relationship between the two of them was perfectly fine. George apologized for his behavior, for leaving out of the blue, and for being so impulsive. Though, let's be honest, he's put up with a lot. More than one would have left out of the blue just by being directly attacked for his beliefs. But this is not George Janko and Bobby Lee. Let's talk about the aftermath of these events and how the relationship with Logan Paul went, which more or less everyone should have figured out by now. But what no one would expect was what happened a few episodes later, where the confrontation between the two would be more noticeable.
3 weeks ago, when you were sitting in that chair, you stormed off this exact podcast because you were upset about something a comedian said.
For some time, he had been making comments against religion, Christianity, and Jesus himself. Little props that went straight to George's patience, until one day he couldn't take it anymore. And that was when Paul himself launched a rather heavy and cruel comment accusing him of not being a sane person, that no matter how religious he was, Jesus wouldn't give him the therapy to get emotional stability.
So
I
then
said
what
you
do I
need
need
a therapist because you believe in Jesus?
What do I need a therapist for then?
Jesus isn't doing it for you. And I
What
believe
do I need
you're,
a therapist for?
I don't believe you're as emotionally mature as you could be.
Logan Paul is talking about emotional stability. Of course. We're talking about the man who got two of his co-hosts to leave,